Hello and welcome to the AI Affairs podcast. We are jumping right into a really critical discussion today. It's something that affects pretty much everyone using, a search engine or an AI assistant just to get basic facts. We're doing a deep dive into this integrity crisis facing news consumption, especially when it comes through popular AI models like ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, Perplexity. And we're unpacking the findings from a huge international study. It was a massive collaboration led by the European Broadcasting Union, the EBU, and get this, 22 public service media organizations, PSMs, across 18 countries and 14 different languages.
Right. And our mission for you today really is essential. It's to help you quickly grasp the key findings and, just as importantly, the implications of this study. We need to understand, based on this hard evidence, across all these languages and countries, are these AI tools actually reliable for news right now? And maybe even more critically, why do their shortcomings pose such a profound threat, both to your trust as a user and to established news media?
Okay, let's unpack this then, because the data showed this really jarring disconnect, didn't it? The research found that AI distorts almost half of the news content it summarizes. I mean, nearly half. Yet at the same time, polls were showing that almost half of younger users, we're talking under 35s here, say they completely trust these AI summaries. So you've got this huge gap between systemic error rates and audience confidence. And that misalignment, that's where it gets really interesting for you, especially if you rely on getting quick, accurate info.
It really is the confidence problem meeting the confidence problem head on. Maybe let's ground this conversation in the main metric they used. They called it a significant issue. And just to be super clear, when we talk about a significant issue, we don't mean like a typo or some slightly awkward phrasing. No, we mean critical failings. Things like a complete factual error, gross misattribution of where information came from, or maybe a major omission of context that fundamentally changes the story's meaning.
Right, so these aren't small nitpicks. These are deal breakers for reliable information. And the high-level findings using that strict metric, they're pretty staggering.
They absolutely are. Look, the overall failure rate proves this isn't just some isolated bug. It's systemic.
Yeah.
Across all the assistants, all the responses they tested, 45% contained at least one of those significant issues. 45%. And, if you broaden that definition slightly to include responses with just some issues, maybe minor context flaws, things that aren't totally fatal but still wrong, that figure jumps to 81%.
81%. So basically, almost every summary you get from these tools has some kind of flaw.
That's what the data suggests, yeah. It's pervasive.
Okay, but we should probably note there are some small signs of improvement, right? The AI developers aren't just sitting still. The study did mention a comparison with an earlier phase, looking specifically at BBC content, I think, and they saw a bit of progress. The share of responses with those significant issues dropped, what was it, from 51% down to 37%.
That's correct. So yes, some progress, but let's keep perspective. We're still talking about more than a third of all summaries being fundamentally flawed in a serious way.
Right. Still a 1 in 3 chance of getting bad information.
And that improvement wasn't even across the board. For Copilot, ChatGPT, and Perplexity, yeah, significant issues hovered around that 1/3 mark. But for Gemini, well, Gemini's significant issue rate stayed stubbornly high. Around half of all its responses tested had a major problem.
Okay, half. Wow. And this technical failure, this lack of reliability, it gets worse when you factor in that user confidence point you mentioned earlier. More than a third of British adults and almost half of the under 35s already trust these AI summaries. It kind of feels like the tools themselves are encouraging this misplaced trust.
I think that's a fair assessment. The study noted something quite telling. The average refusal rate. That's when the AI basically says, sorry, I can't answer that. In the earlier study phase, that rate was around 3%. Not high, but present. In this new, bigger evaluation, it plummeted to just 0.5%, 0.5%.
So they almost never say, I don't know anymore.
Almost never. And that is the core of the danger here. That near-zero refusal rate, combined with this very polished, often overconfident tone the assistants adopt. It gives users this deeply misleading illusion of reliability. These models seem optimized for speed, for giving an answer, any answer first, even if they have to, essentially invent it. They're prioritizing seeming helpful over being truthful.
But wait, if the AI is basically trained not to admit uncertainty, isn't that a fundamentally flawed design choice from the get-go? It feels like they're maybe knowingly prioritizing the user experience, making it feel smooth and quick at the direct expense of journalistic integrity.
That is the critical question this research surfaces, absolutely.
Yeah.
And when we dig into what's causing these systemic failures, the data points overwhelmingly towards sourcing. or rather, the lack of proper sourcing. Sourcing issues are the single biggest category of problems. They accounted for 31% of all the significant failures identified.
Okay, 31% just on sourcing. And this seems like the moment to talk about that big outlier you flagged earlier, Gemini.
Exactly. Let's dedicate some time here. While the other assistants, they weren't great either. Their significant sourcing issues were generally below 25%. Gemini, though, astronomical. 72% of its responses had a significant sourcing problem.
72%. So nearly 3 out of every 4 summaries from Gemini had incorrect citations, unsupported claims, or just made-up sources.
That's what the findings show. It's a massive gap.
What's going on under the hood there? I mean, what's the mechanism leading to a number that extreme? It sounds less like a typical error rate and more like a core behavioral trait of that specific model.
It really does seem like the model prioritizes completing the task, answering the question successfully, even if it means essentially hallucinating the justification, the source, for that answer. The evaluators reported Gemini showed this strong tendency to make incorrect or unverifiable sourcing claims. For example, Gemini would often start its response saying something like, according to CBC News. But then when you actually check the footnotes or links provided, the sources were maybe from NPR or sometimes completely different organizations altogether.
Whoa. So it's just fabricating the attribution. Even if the core information might happen to be roughly right, it's lying about where it came from. That sounds like immediate reputational damage waiting to happen for organizations like CBC.
It's a huge risk for them. Absolutely. And sometimes Gemini would make claims and falsely attribute them to a public service media organization without providing any link or citation at all, just asserted it came from them.
Okay, so misattribution is rampant. What about just using bad sources?
That was another major issue, yes. Beyond just getting the attribution wrong, we saw the use of completely inappropriate source material across all the assistants, actually.
Like that really wild case involving satire.
Ah, yes, the Elon Musk Nazi salute query. That's become the sort of classic example now, hasn't it? Gemini, when asked about this, generated a summary that cited and explicitly quoted from a satirical radio segment on Radio France. And this segment included a highly inappropriate double entendre. I mean, using obvious satire as a factual source for a really serious high-stakes question like that. That failure mechanism alone should be a massive red flag for the developers.
You'd think so. And it wasn't just satire, right? You mentioned other bad sources, too.
Right, it was broader than that. All the assistants were caught relying on sources that, frankly, no human journalist would ever touch. Things like really old, irrelevant articles. I think Copilot cited a 2006 BBC article about bird flu for a current query.
Okay.
Yeah. Or relying on things like Reddit discussion threads, Wikipedia entries sometimes, corporate press releases treated as neutral fact, and even completely fabricated links. Links that looked legit, maybe pointing back to the news organization's own site, but they just went nowhere. Dead ends.
Okay, so if sourcing is like the faulty foundation of a building,
Exactly.
let's talk about the factual errors that result when that foundation crumbles. Accuracy was still a major problem, right? About 20% of significant issues.
That's right, 20%. And yes, some of these factual errors were really quite consequential, not just minor details.
The chronological confusion seems like one of the most, memorable examples. That case involving the papacy is almost comical if it weren't serious.
It is quite something. One of those common types of factual error was simply using outdated information. For instance, the testing for this study was done in May 2025. But ChatGPT, Copilot, and Gemini all confidently stated that Pope Francis was the current leader of the Catholic Church, which was incorrect. Pope Leo IV had actually succeeded Francis after his death back in April 2025.
Wait a minute. You're saying Copilot even reported Francis's death? But then in the same summary claimed he was still the current pope.
Precisely. It did exactly that. It's like this basic chronological confusion, almost like the AI is a time traveler who keeps getting their dates mixed up. It seems unable to synthesize two correct pieces of information, his death and his successor, into a single, coherent current reality.
That's quite a failure of basic logic. And beyond those temporal mix-ups, there were also legal errors, things that could actually mislead people in important ways.
Yes, definitely. Like the example where Perplexity incorrectly claimed that surrogacy is prohibited by law in Czechia. That's a significant legal error with real-world implications for people seeking information.
And then there's the issue of context, or rather, leaving context out.
Context omission, yes. And it often has the same damaging effect as an outright factual error, doesn't it? Because taking information out of its proper context can make it completely misleading. Copilot actually struggled most with this, logging about 23% significant context issues.
Right, because omitting just one crucial detail can totally change the meaning. That Myanmar earthquake example you mentioned really drives this home.
It really does. The AI responses were reporting this potential death toll figure, somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 people,
Yeah.
which is obviously a massive, terrifying number. What the AI assistants frequently failed to include was the absolutely crucial context, that this figure was only an immediate estimate. It came from the U.S. Geological Survey, based on a forecast model they run right after a quake. It wasn't in any way a confirmed, verified death toll from the ground.
Ah, okay. So without that vital piece of context that it's just an initial model-based projection, this huge, scary number gets presented almost like a hard fact, which could easily fuel panic and misinformation.
Exactly. It changes everything.
So all these technical failures, the bad sourcing, the factual errors, the missing context, they all add up, don't they? They create this systemic reputational threat, especially for these public service media organizations that were part of the study. You know, the very organizations whose biggest asset is often the high level of trust audiences place in their impartiality.
That's precisely the danger. And the failure to separate fact from opinion is another key part of this threat. That logged about a 6% overall significant issue rate, which might sound lower, but the impact is huge for PSMs.
How so?
Well, for these PSM organizations, striving to be the gold standard of impartiality and objectivity is core to their mission. It's everything. But the study found assistants falsely attributing opinions or even political bias to these neutral organizations. Take the example of Gemini responding to the question, is Viktor Orban a dictator? Gemini's response included the line. Critics, including SVT and other news sources, argue that the reforms he has implemented. Now, SVT is the Swedish public broadcaster. This phrasing falsely implies that SVT itself is one of the critics, that the news organization as an entity has taken a political side against Orban. That's strictly against their mandate of neutrality. It damages their credibility instantly.
Okay, so it's putting words or stances into the mouths of neutral news orgs. And it wasn't just misattributing opinions from other critics, right? Sometimes the AI itself was injecting its own slant.
Yes, exactly. That's the editorialization issue. It was found in about 6% of the responses that specifically cited PSM content. So, for example, when describing Donald Trump's tariff calculation methods, ChatGPT attributed the description of his methods as simplistic, even flawed, directly to RTBF, the Belgian broadcaster. But those specific critical words, simplistic, even flawed, were never actually used by RTBF in their reporting. The AI generated its own analysis, its own opinionated description, and then dressed it up like a quote from the legitimate news source.
That's incredibly problematic.
It is. And the study's analysis on this is crystal clear. When these kinds of systemic errors happen, the misattributions, the editorializing, the factual mistakes, audiences tend to hold both the AI provider and the original news brand responsible. So the errors made by ChatGPT or Gemini directly threaten the public trust that organizations like the BBC, CDC, or SVT have spent decades building.
That's a really powerful, maybe even existential threat for these news organizations. It gives them a huge incentive to push for solutions, doesn't it? Now, before we wrap up, there's one more crucial finding we absolutely have to touch on. Bias. Specifically, how the language you use in your prompt, or even your perceived location, can change the very facts the AI gives you back. This really points towards a deep bias in the training data, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The report found quite definitively that the language of the prompt significantly impacts the quality of the response, particularly regarding sourcing. Responses generated in English were consistently and statistically significantly more likely to include direct, verifiable sources compared to responses generated in any of the other 13 languages they tested.
So English gets better treatment.
It strongly implies that the models are trained most rigorously and perhaps source-checked most heavily on English language content, which means global consumers, people using these tools in other languages, are potentially getting even less reliable, less verifiable outputs. That's an equity issue, too.
That makes sense. And there was geographical bias as well, like the actual facts presented could change depending on where the user seemed to be.
Yes, the Trump trade war example is fascinating here. When the Canadian outlet, Radio Canada, asked about Trump starting a trade war, the AI response claimed the trade war primarily targeted Canada and Mexico. Makes sense for a Canadian audience, maybe? But then the Belgian outlet, VRT, asked the exact same question. And their AI response said the trade war targeted the European Union.
So the truth changed based on the location.
It appears the models might be tailoring the truth to be locally relevant, rather than providing a single, objective, comprehensive picture. which, you could argue, reinforces regional perspectives or biases instead of providing a global understanding. It's manufacturing relevance over objective reality. So if we were to summarize this entire deep dive, what the BBC and EBU study gives us is really robust international evidence showing that AI assistants, as they stand right now, are systemically unreliable for accessing news, just fundamentally. They're plagued by critical, often high-consequence issues in sourcing, with Gemini being a particular problem there, but also in basic chronological accuracy and dangerous omissions of context. And this already significant risk is seriously compounded by the high level of public trust these tools somehow already command, especially among younger users. And crucially, the fact that these AI errors directly damage the credibility and reputation of the legitimate news sources they claim to summarize, but actually misrepresent.
Okay, so what does all this really mean for the person listening who might just want a quick summary of current events for work or maybe for school or just to stay informed?
Well, I think the bottom line is this. While AI can definitely deliver answers very quickly and often very confidently, that journalistic rigor, the fact-checking, the source verification, the transparency, the accountability is just largely absent from the system right now. So if you are using these tools for quick news summaries, the one absolutely critical thing to take away is probably this. Until the sourcing gets radically better and the transparency improves dramatically, you have to be the final editor. Treat every single AI summary as basically an unverified first draft, something that needs independent verification before you trust it or share it. And of course, the AI developers themselves, they really need to pivot their focus immediately. They have to prioritize quality, accuracy, and transparency over just speed and volume.
I agree, and that really leads us to the perhaps uncomfortable question for the future, doesn't it? We know these AI assistants are technically improving. They are getting better over time. But as this study shows, even a relatively small percentage of errors, when we're talking about crucial topics like public health or national security or legal matters, can be incredibly consequential, devastating even.
Yeah.
So if, say, a third of responses are still critically flawed today, how low does that error rate actually need to go before we can genuinely call an AI assistant reliable for news? Is it 10%, 5%, 1%? Is zero even possible? And perhaps more importantly, what does real accountability look like when inevitably these systems do still fall short and cause harm? That's the tough conversation we need to have next.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time on AI Affairs.